Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good Shabbos, everyone. Good 10th day of the Omer, if that's where you are. Um, it's really a blessing, as always, to be with all of you this morning, teaching a little Torah, learning a little Torah. We'll be working with Parashat Achrei, but in order to get there, we're going to go a little bit backwards. So I'm going to, I'm going to present as I typically do, where we're going to do a bit of a full portion. And then if you have questions, please do chat them directly. That would be most helpful. And then we will do rounds of questions and comments throughout and a little bit later on. But I first want to situate us again after Pesach. We have, returned to the world of chametz. We have, we're moving from one chag to another chag. We are counting the Omer. We're not going to be talking about that so much today. But that is very much part of where we are calendarically. We are returning to our Torah cycle after taking a bit of a break. There's plenty of Torah to be read, of course, over Pesach itself. We did not actually have a parasha. So we are now returning to the book of Vayikra, of the book of Leviticus, and we are, interestingly enough, we are actually going to be reading this week Acharei, which often gets paired with Kedoshim. That's not the case this year because we have a leap year. So our parasha contains both traditional readings for Yom Kippur, which is very interesting. We've gone from Pesach and we are already moving to the other end of the year, or the other end of the Chag cycle. I also want to say, I just said the two traditional readings for Yom Kippur. I do know that in the Reform world, there is a different reading for Yom Kippur afternoon. We're not even going to look at Leviticus 18, but I just wanted to frame that that's where we are. We are looking at the portions of Torah that are traditionally read on Yom Kippur, namely Leviticus 16 and 18. Parasha is called Acharei Mot, after the first words of the parasha, after the death. So in order to really understand how this ceremony of atonement in the Mishkan happens, it's a very elaborate ceremony involving goats and involving certain kinds of ritual actions with blood and thinking about atonement and the Kohen Gadol on the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. In order to understand where we are narratively, we're going to go back 6 chapters, and I'm now going to invite us to do some screen share. We're going to go back 6 chapters to chapter 10 in the middle of Parashat Shmini, which we read several weeks ago now. And I'm going to basically do a paraphrase, but you'll have the verses on the screen of the incidents that happen. There's very little narrative in the book of Leviticus. This is one of the very few narratives that we have in chapter 10, verse 1, where we have 2 of Aharon's 4 sons. Aharon, of course, is the Kohen Gadol, also Moses' brother. Kohen Gadol, high priest, also Moses' brother. Most of the book of Leviticus is very much a ritual manual for the priests, for the Kohanim. And there is this narrative, which gets talked about quite a bit, but I'm going to invite us into doing a close reading of the text. And I'm going to do a little bit of a paraphrase. Then I want to actually know what I'm going to do. If someone feels ready to read the English, I would actually, if this is okay, I would love to call on someone to read the first 3 or 4 verses of chapter 10 in Leviticus. If you are interested in reading, just make sure you have the text ready and feel ready to jump right in. But if that's you, please feel free to raise your hand.
I did see Marcy's virtual hand first. So Marcy, I am asking you to unmute. Thank you so much.
Should I read now?
Yes, please.
Now Aaron's sons Nadav and Abihu each took his fire pan, put fire in it, and laid incense on it. And they offered before Adonai alien fire, which had not been enjoined upon them. And fire came forth from Adonai and consumed them. Thus they died, and at the instance of Adonai. Then Moses said to Aaron, "This is what Adonai meant by saying," and I can't read this, "through those near to me, I show myself holy, and gain glory before all the people. And Aaron was silent.
Thank you so much. We're going to pause there. So these three verses are very poignant and very tragic. We have a scenario from the text of the Torah, we know actually very little about what happened. We know that Aharon has four sons, Eleazar, Itamar, Nadav, and Abihu. Eleazar and Itamar are either not involved in this or on the sidelines. They are not affected. And Nadav and Abihu are they meet their end in this really horrible way because they bring forward, as it says in our verses, they take the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Abihu, they take their fire pans, their instruments for ritual offering, they place that fire upon it, they place incense, they come close before Hashem, before God, they bring this Eish Zara that was not asked for, that was not commanded, literally. It was not tziva otam, not commanded of them. And that fire came forth from Hashem, from before the face of Hashem. I'm doing a very inside translation right now. And it ate them, the tohal. It ate them and they died before Hashem. It ate them. It consumed them. It's very interesting that the Hebrew actually uses the word tochal. It ate them. And we don't know why Nadav and Abihu brought this Eish Zara. We don't know why they brought this strange fire. There are a lot of different commentaries on it. I encourage you to look at that. We're not going to go into so much of that today. But we have to grapple with these verses to be able to understand where our parsha picks up. And we're going to do that in just a moment. Because we have this gap between this chapter, Aaron has lost his sons. Moses then gives him this very interesting explanation of like why that happened. As maybe it's a comfort. I really don't quite know, right? It doesn't land that way for me, right? Maybe it lands for some of you, but it doesn't really land that way for me because we see at the end here, Vayidol Aharon, and Aaron was silent. There was a lot of commentary when this came up in the Torah reading cycle a couple of weeks ago about, how do you mourn and what does that mean and how do we show up in those moments and what were Aaron's emotions and feelings of losing two of his sons in this tremendous way, and what does it mean to come close and then to really, to come close and then to be impacted by fire in such a tremendous way, right? And there's a certain sense in the book of Vayikra. We are in the week of Gevurah and the Omer, which feels extremely appropriate for this. There is a sense in the book of Vayikra that the way that ritual happens is boundaried in a particular way. And there's something beautiful about that. And I really, over my years of practice, I've come to appreciate that. There's something really important about how ritual is created and what ritual is intended to do when we are engaged in it. And when we create ritual in a particular way, with a particular structure, there is a certain sense of, perhaps we could say, ease in that. We know what's coming. I think probably many of us have thought about this recently with the Seder, right? The Seder, of course, deriving from the word for order. And though there's a lot of room for play and creativity, there's a certain ritual element to it that really holds us together. And so too, when you are a Kohen in the Mishkan and you are doing this avodah, you're doing this sacred service, there is a certain way in which that happens. Because it can't be unbounded. It has to be very aligned in a way so that we can actually transcend and really achieve the goal of the ritual. So this is not about assigning blame to Nadav and Abihu. I read a beautiful piece by Shefa Gold yesterday, by Rabbi Shefa Gold, about letting go of the door of blame as a very needed practice spiritually right now. It's a really beautiful piece. This notion of thinking about why or what did Nadav and Abihu do wrong, I find less instructive than thinking about why ritual is important. Perhaps we were so overcome with devotion to Hashem that they wanted to bring an offering in their own unique way. And of course, what happened to them, their death is just utterly tragic and horrible and so, profound and something that we have to grapple with. And I think that there's something really interesting about the way in which ritual action, we'll go forward a little bit into our chapter of our Parashat today, chapter 16. We'll get there in a minute. How the service in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur was done. A very particular, very formulated way. In the Mishnah, the Mishnah Yoma, which is a huge piece of Mishnah, and it talks about Yom Kippur, and there's a corresponding tractate of the first 7 chapters. It has 8 chapters. This whole chapter is about Yom Kippur. The first 7 of those 8 chapters are all about how to prepare the Kohen for Yom Kippur. It's only when you get to the 8th chapter that you actually get into themes of tshuva. The 8th chapter of Masechet Yoma, of Tractate Yoma, is beautiful, and I really encourage people to learn it every Elul. But the first 7 chapters are about preparation of the Kohen and what happens if any number of things go wrong, and what are the ways we're going to deal with those inevitabilities? Because this is such a sacred, as one of my teachers in rabbinical school would explain, Yom Kippur was the day when we really did our spiritual cleaning, right? I think there's no coincidence that we're learning about this now because we've just passed through Pesach. We've done that cleaning of chametz. Some of us have the practice of thinking about that spiritually as well, but we've gone through physical preparation. Many of us spent a long time preparing. Many of us spent a lot of resources, financially and otherwise, to allow for Pesach to be observed. In some ways that's our own korban, but in other ways it's really hard. We're putting out all of these resources for this 8-day or 7-day, depending on where you are and how you practice, festival, and we're doing this cleansing to remind ourselves of our liberation from Mitzrayim, and then we move in our parsha to Yom Kippur and that spiritual cleansing. But if we're going to think about the ritual of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, which we'll move to, we can't do that without first taking a minute and looking at these psukim, these verses in chapter 10, because chapter 16 picks right up, and it tells us chronologically, and I'll now invite us to move towards chapter 16, which I will do as well. It invites us into a narrative that we're told we pick up directly from where we stopped, where we ended with the death of Aharon. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe ve'al Aharon lemor dabru al ben hold on a second, I'm just making sure I have this correct here. I was like in the chapter below here. Here we go. Sorry about that. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe acharei mot shnei bnei Aharon b'karovtam lifnei Hashem v'yamutu. Right? So in our Torah, we literally are told that we're picking up with this extensive ritual explanation of how the Torah, or how the service would happen on Yom Kippur after the deaths of these 2 of Aaron's sons. And I think that there is something really important about that, because it feels to me here like there is actually a reestablishment of ritual order. We had a few chapters. We had a chapter on kashrut, and we had multiple chapters on nita and zava and Za'arat, in between, we talked about human consumption and human bodily emission. And now we've returned to the Mishkan. Of course, we talk about the Mishkan with Sarat and when can you come back, and same thing with Nidan, Zavad. Like those are the laws around ritual Tum'ah or Entara, which I'm going to leave untranslated. I apologize because Tum'ah and Tara are often translated as purity and impurity, but those are very loaded terms. And so I'm setting us up to now focus on our chapter where we've had this digression, we've had the deaths of Nadav and Abihu, we've learned about proper slaughter and proper eating of meat. We then move into thinking about birthing and dying. We then and thinking about what it means to move in and out of states of purity and impurity. And now we are returning, and this is related to your average Israelite. Now we are returning to the priests. So the reason I spent all of that time really setting us up is because I think even beyond the details, right? And the details are extraordinarily extensive. And I'm going to invite us actually to go through some of that. Although because it is such a lengthy chapter, I think that we aren't going to go through all of it because that would take our time. We have very particular structure of when and how actions are taken and when and how different ritual pieces happen. And that is important for maintaining a sense of order. I think in a world that feels very chaotic, a world in which Aaron lost two of his sons in the act of service, that was jarring, that was shattering. Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron was silent. Because what do you say in a situation like that? And so, in order to kind of get us back on the right path, which is really what Yom Kippur fundamentally is about, getting us back on the right path, we have to do so ritually. And so, in many of our communities, we think about Yom Kippur and we think about the rabbinic interpretation, right? This is the day about thinking about our year. It's a day of deep introspection. It's a day for some, and I say this advisedly because again, like this is a very significant practice that needs a lot of skill. This is not something that I would ever encourage anybody to just do. This is something that would need to be done with the guidance of a very trained instructor. Some people think of Yom Kippur as a practice of their eventual death. And so the way in which they encounter the day is preparing themselves for that eventuality. As I said, that is not something to do on one's own, and that is not something to do without a very, very skilled practitioner. Because again, as we've been talking about with ritual, you enter into that space of practice and you exit out of that space of practice in a very prescribed way. That is not a skill that I am trained in, and therefore it is not a practice that I would teach or lead because I don't have that skill. Those who do so with a lot of integrity and structure. And so too, when Aaron enters the Kodesh HaKodeshim on Yom Kippur, and when Aaron engages in all of the ritual actions that happen around the atonement, around the goats and Azazel, and figuring out which goat's going to be used for atonement and which is going to go to Azazel, all of that is done in a way of entering the space, performing the action, and exiting the space, hopefully. In some communities on Yom Kippur, there is the practice of actually reenacting this particular service during the Musaf or additional prayer service. Not everyone does this. Some communities do this in a separate service, and I know there's a huge diversity. In my community, that's how we have typically done it on Yom Kippur. We've actually reenacted this entire chapter in the ways that we obviously, the person leading Musaf, wears different costuming, and there's a whole thing. And it brings people into that, like, what is this? And what are the stakes here? Because as we saw when we looked at the deaths of Nadav and Abihu, the stakes of mistake in the Mishkan are very high. In fact, there's a piyut called Marei Kohen, which is all about how the Kohen appeared when Kohen left Kodesh HaKodeshim. There's a very happy chorus that people tend to sing and dance. But I also wish people would actually stop and actually read the words and think like, we are actually grateful. This entire piyut is actually a moment of gratitude that the Kohen left this ritual space uninjured, unlike what happened several chapters before. So because choosing to serve in the Mishkan is so intense, there has to be a structure to allow that to happen, because Yom Kippur, if Pesach is about our physical cleaning, Yom Kippur is about our spiritual cleaning, and Yom Kippur has got really high stakes. We are hoping that we're going to have a better, I mean, let's just name it. Like, what is Yom Kippur ultimately about? Yeah, it's about making, it's about trying to do tshuva. It's about really wanting to make sure that we are on the right road, that we are on the right path, that we are turning and returning. But fundamentally, what are the holidays about, and especially Yom Kippur? And this feels even more poignant this year. They're fundamentally about praying that we are going to have an okay year. That is fundamentally what this whole cycle is about. It's just a deep plea to the universe. The year will be okay. And I have not been able to escape that this year. I have gone back over and over to that, over and over to what this ritual is meant to do. Yes, it's about atonement, and it's about, tshuva and being in right relationship with Hashem and being in right relationship with others. Particularly, this chapter is about being in right relationship with Hashem. But as Yom Kippur has evolved and shifted over time, it's really our people coming to grips with the reality that the world is so out of our control. And we're hoping in community and together and with a lot of anticipation, we're hoping for a good year. And we know that that might not happen. And so too, with Aaron and the deaths of Nadav and Abihu, you hope when you go in there to do these things that it's going to go well for you. And the notion of, going behind the curtain and serving Hashem and doing these things. And then it doesn't always. And so returning to that place, after such a tragedy. We don't know how much time has necessarily elapsed in the Torah from the time of the deaths of Nadav and Abihu, because we had this very abrupt, narrative interruption where we went on a couple of different journeys. We talked about kashrut, and we talked about birth, and we talked about particular kinds of ailments, and we talked about particular kinds of seclusion. And then we come back to the Mishkan this week. We come back to Aaron. We come back to these instructions. And that is such a unique thing to Leviticus. We're going to really stay in that space for a while, but it's just something to think about in terms of how we think about the parasha in our own lives, right? Is to go back to our opening verse in chapter 16 as contrasted with our verses in chapter 10. The Torah is telling us that this is happening Achrei Nadav and Abihu for a reason. The rabbis call our parasha Achrei for a reason. There's something that we are being asked to think about. And I'm going to stop there. And I'm now we have a little bit of time. I will first invite folks to actually have written comments and reflections, because I know that I've said quite a bit and we've kind of meandered in different journeys. And so if anything is unclear, please let me know. And I would love it if folks can type into the chat, and then I will invite Mara to read some of those for us aloud. And then if folks have verbal comments, we can take those as well. But I'm gonna invite that to be short, to the point, and really focusing on our teaching today to the extent that we can. And we want to hear from as many folks as possible. So we're going to start with the chat.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Yes, we have a lot of comments and thoughts in the chat. I think people are having a hard time sitting with Nadav and Abihu, who we can think about how wrong or right their actions were, but who were killed And I think people are having a really
Yeah.
hard time with that rather
Yeah.
than some other form of punishment. And I think people are also questioning, did they know what they were doing was not in order?
Totally. I think that's really important. I have a very hard time with it too. It's such a disturbing and difficult passage in Torah. And part of what it means to be in my opinion, in my understanding, in my practice, what it means to be in relationship with Torah is to wrestle with it, and as we do on Yom Kippur, we return again and again. We don't do so without wrestling. We don't do so without questioning. We don't do so without trying to be better people. And so too, when we think about the deaths from Nadav and Abihu, right, like we have no idea. The commentaries have a lot of fun talking about this, but the reality is, if we're looking at the Pshat, we're looking at the actual text of the Torah, we truly do not know why this happened. It's devastating. We have no idea if Nadav and Abihu knew what they were doing was wrong. We
Yeah.
have no idea why the fire went and consumed them and ate them. Literally, the Torah says, the Torah says, and eat them. It's such a terrible image, especially in these times. And so part of, I think, what we do as learners of Torah is to just name, this is horrible, right? And we don't push away, and a lot of how I teach is very informed by my mindfulness practice, right? A lot of what we want to do as humans when we encounter something that's really hard. I think a lot of us right now are dealing with this in the world and in our own lives. When we find something that's really, really hard, we want to push it away. We want to almost like take our hand and just push it away. I don't want to deal with that. Or this is upsetting me. Or I don't know how to handle it. Or I'm having strong visceral reactions to it, or whatever it is. And I imagine many of us are struggling with those things in so many areas right now. And we don't want to face it. It's too hard. It feels like there's no way to do it on one's own. It feels overwhelming. We can shut down. And I imagine that's what Aaron's doing here when Aaron is silent. And we know somatically, like in the world of somatics, which is Peter Levine wrote a really good book about this, and it's really about understanding how trauma and just how I'm going to say it a little differently. It's about understanding how our nervous systems react to the environment around us. That's the way I would define it. I think other people would define it differently. I am not a practitioner. I am a learner in this. So I am simply sharing, a very learner definition. But it's really about allowing the nervous system to interact with the environment and understanding how that happens and understanding how to skillfully approach it. So when we're sitting with this text that's so informed, we can't understand. I mean, the reason I focused on the text from Shmini, even though it's Achrei mode, is because the truth is the Torah is connected. Torah is always interconnected. We divide it into parshiot so that we can get through it on an annual basis. But the Torah itself is interconnected. The Torah comments on itself as we're seeing in our parsha, and we can't understand our parsha if we don't sit with these depths of Nadav and Abihu, and we don't sit with why they killed. Why were they consumed by this Aish? We don't know. We can come up with all kinds of explanations. Maybe they were arrogant. Maybe they overstepped their boundaries. But nevertheless, neither of those things seem to justify what happens to these poor guys. And we don't and so for me, when I think about the not knowing, I don't then say to myself, okay, I don't know, therefore I just have to accept that that's the way it is. Rather, I say, I don't know, and why on earth did this happen? And this feels so deeply wrong. And what can we do to make sure it never happens again? And I think that actually the Torah is answering its own question. Because when the Torah lays out this Yom Kippur ritual, which is extremely intricate, when the Torah does that, Torah is saying the stakes are really high. It's Yom Kippur. It's the Day of Atonement. This is the holiest day of the year. This is the only day, Aaron, the only day that you and your sons will be able to go to the Kodesh HaKodeshim. The only day. You cannot ever enter this space any other day of the year. You need to be totally prepared for that because the stakes are extremely, extremely high. And let me prepare a structure so that you can enter that space and you can exit that space and do so, God willing, smoothly. And I think we learn, and that's what the Torah is saying. It's like, wow, we need structure. That still does not answer our question. Why were Nadav and Abihu killed? And I think what it invites us to do is a lot of soul searching. And also it invites us to sit with the tragedy, the real tragedy of this. And because we return to them every year, we bring them to mind and we just honor their lives. We honor. We don't know what they were thinking. I mean, I would like to believe that Nadav and Abihu were deeply sincere and maybe an accident happened and the Torah is defining it as an Eish Sarah to explain maybe some horrible, horrible, honest to goodness accident happened. I mean, if we think about what these ritual actions included, it was not a sanitary, like sanitary is the wrong word. It was not a simple process. This was very, very intricate and you had to be prepared. And so that's really what I sit with. And I allow myself to be with those feelings and to say, like, this is really hard. And there are so many things that are out of my control, but I still get to be very upset about those things. And I get to think, like, what can I do to make sure this never happens again?
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I'm very lucky that I get to see some of the midrash that a lot of our participants are commenting in the chat for me. It sort of regarding maybe why God did this.
Yeah,
and
let's explore some of that.
some of them are challenging. Someone mentioned how maybe this was not a punishment and was evidence that the two sons were very earnest and wanted to be close to God, and God brought them close. I think that there's a lot of that can be both beautiful and challenging. And then something I have never thought about is that in a certain way, when people die within the tabernacle, it looks like human sacrifice. And how do we think about that, which is really complicated in a Jewish framework. And we also have 3 hands raised, so I know that I just put a lot out there, but up to you if you want to speak to that or call on others.
Let's take the 3. Try to keep your comments concise. I'll hear all of them. We'll take all of them back to back to back, and then we'll see what time we have for closing.
Okay, great. So we now have 2 hands raised. That's great. We'll go to Arnold and then Ross. And I echo Rabbi Lauren in saying, let's make our question a question.
Hi, thank you very much. When I think about God's action, I feel like he should atone for his sin of killing these 2 people. He was willing to let all the Jews live after the golden calf. He was talked into it by Moses. He was willing to let the people of Sodom and Gomorrah live if he could find 10 people. So here he just acted without even asking. And I think that was wrong. And I think I know this is weird to say he should atone for that, but I feel that.
That's extremely valid. I'm so grateful that you shared that. Absolutely. I don't think you're alone in that feeling. All right, do we have other comments,
Yes.
other hands?
Go ahead, Ross.
Thank you. It seems to me, and that God tells us in the text when he says that Zerah, the alien or unauthorized, whatever it was that they did. We don't know if it was intentional, but it seems like it wasn't an accidental slip. And based on God's reaction, it is one that it's condemned elsewhere in Torah. It was high-handed, meaning maybe intentional. And if we do rely on God and his attributes of being just and holy, which we must do, is maybe a visceral reaction, but he's reminding us he's holy, and we come to expect or even demand his mercies and his blessings, since we're so used to them. But he reminds us from time to time on his most holy place and the right that they didn't do it well. And what do we depend on? Going back to your early comments of this chaotic world, we must depend on his holiness and his attributes to get us through such a thing. And they did it. They did it badly, and it might bother us inside, but we have to depend on him being right and not us.
Thank you very much, Ross, for those comments. I really, really appreciate your reflections. There is, I mean, certainly a lot of the commentators definitely talk about that this was very, that Nadav and Abihu were arrogant. They did not follow instructions, and there are, and in those commentaries, there are ways in which you do what you're not supposed to, consequences, and like whatever one thinks about that, like we can be with that. We can also be with that reality. We can be with the reality of the world as it is, and we can sit with all of those things. And it's up to us, I think, to really be with what our own reactions are, but also to name and acknowledge the world is the way the world is. And we do, our actions, our choices have impact. And like we can sit with all the complications. I'm finding myself like sitting with both of the comments we've heard and really hearing a lot of truth in both, and feeling like it's very important to challenge ourselves to be with multiplicity. I think that's really important. So I would love to hear a couple of other comments. I've spoken so much. I'd love to hear, I know we're almost at time, but if we have a comment or two, I'd love to hear a few more comments.
We have 3 more hands raised. We'll start with Joan. And would you like to hear all of them, Rabbi?
We have time. I think we have a few minutes, so just try to be as concise as possible, friends, and we'll try to get to as many people as we can.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi. My question has to do with the word alien, why it hasn't been addressed thus far, because it seems to be the linchpin here, that they approached and the fire that they probably would normally have done was somehow alien or different. And so the question dovetails into, how do we post-temple era, who are inventing Judaism all the time, how do we think about what that invention can entail? I'm quite involved in creative methods of pursuing Jewish practice, so and always have been, and took it kind of as for granted that it was okay to do that. But this segment seems to point very authoritatively to the strictures about even thinking you can approach or walk into a sanctuary you normally walk into, because obviously they were invested with that permission during the rest of their performative lives as priests. Why manishtana, and this act, and what was alien about it?
That is such a rich insight. Thank you so much. I would love to get to that, but we do have a couple other hands, right?
Yes. We'll go to Earl.
Okay, folks can keep their comments brief, and I'll try to briefly address them. I'm sorry we don't have more time today, friends.
So thank you so much. You always do this in such an excellent way. And I, who am physically handicapped myself, have such tremendous admiration for your capacity to keep all of this in your head, as I can't. Anyway, with that introduction, I basically read this as some people played with fire and they made a mistake and they got burned up. And then later on, some other people went in and they didn't get burned up. And then there was a mythology built around that. but fire is fire.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, as we're seeing now in sort of pretty much throughout the world on a warming planet, we're going to see more fire.
Yeah. You know, I think I'm so sorry to whomever has their hand up. I want to address these two comments, and I really do apologize that we don't have more time, but I think these are important and I don't want to just leave them. So with your permission, I'm going to address these and we'll close here. Is that okay with folks?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so yes, I think that there's a lot. So when we talk about, I think the translation, and I apologize, I only have the Hebrew text in front of me, but I think the translation alien that you're referring to, Joan, is zara. If a foreign is a better, I think a more accurate translation in the Hebrew for the kind of fire, and zara, a foreign or an outside or a different kind of fire or action. And so when we think about, I mean, the rabbis, you talk about post-temple, we're inventing Judaism all the time, right? The reality, as I understand it, is that that's been true of our people from the get-go. We are always, creating ritual, we're always iterating, we're always building on things. Even when we are saying that we're not doing that, even when we're saying, as the Hatam Sofer, who was a very prominent forebearer of the Haredi world, says, everything new in Torah, everything new is prohibited by Torah. Well, that is making a claim on Judaism. And I think, there is something about, and again, I return in my response to the fact that we are in the week of Gevurah and the counting of the Omer, which Gevurah is about strength, about discipline, all of these things. We can and must, I think creatively about ritual and think about innovation and think about change. And we do so in structure, right? We do so in the context of container. We do that in lots of different ways. Because if, like, for example, if I were to show up on a Yom Kippur, if I were to show up to Kol Nidrei and coming with, a certain openness, I have experiences that even if they adhere to the traditional format, like there were things that happened that really shifted the space and like it does have an effect. So it's not to say don't iterate. Quite the contrary. How are we doing it? In what kind of intentionality are we doing it? That's the role of ritual in our journey, I believe. I do have a more traditional perspective in terms of my practice, for example, but even there, that container can allow for innovation. And I'll say to Earl's here, really beautiful, like there is, which I think relates to what Ross said also, like there is a sense of fire is fire. Action choices are choices. Choices have consequences. It reminds me of the great Musar master, Rav Eliyahu Dessler, the great 20th century Musar master, who talks about the Bechira point, that the choice point, we have faced these every day, multiple times a day. We then have, this is again my kind of commentary on his point, we then have agency around how we think about those choices. And so again, we can sit with, and many of us are sitting with, the real challenge and upset around what happened to Nadav and Abihu. In no way am I justifying, action. And I am naming and inviting us to name that choices, we make choices every day. Our species makes choices in our personal lives, in our geopolitical lives. Like all of these things have consequences and they all have impact. So we just name that and claim that as we move through this parsha. So I'm going to close here. We're a little over time. I'm going to close here. But thank you so much for having me, as always.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, and thank you all for starting your Erev Shabbat with us. As always, wishing you a Shabbat Shalom, and we hope to see you next week. Bye for now.